Hi guys, first things first, if you're watching, hi Martin. I'm here for the second edition of my classic and contemporary series, and this time it's on two novels, Howard's End by Forster, which was published in 1910, and On Beauty by Zadie Smith, which came out in 2005, neither of which I loved, but I definitely appreciated Howard's End a lot more after reading On Beauty. We'll get to that. I should also say that I read the Forster about a year and a half ago and didn't take any notes, so my my thoughts won't exactly be as nuanced as I would like, but I've really appreciated this opportunity to think back on the aspects of this that have stayed with me. Let's start with our classic, which orbits several English families. One of them is the Schlegels, who are three young siblings living off their family's inherited wealth. They're idealistic pseudo-socialists. Another family is the Wilcoxes, who are a much more father, mother, grown children traditional structure where the father is a rich, practical businessman. And the final family is the Basts, who are a husband and wife hovering in the low middle class. And as you can already tell, this is a novel that's preoccupied with class, with what it feels and looks like to live on various incomes in part, but also, and even more so, how people of different class backgrounds view and treat one another, and what this says about English society as a whole. Spoiler, it's not super functional. One of the great things is that it's clear Forster expects the majority of his readers to be Schlegel-like, and so he makes the Schlegels the glue of the book, the main vantage point, and yet he treats them with the same mix of compassion and contempt as any of the other characters. So the novel opens in this very famous way with letters from the middle Schlegel sibling, Helen, who's spending some time with the Wilcoxes at their summer home, Howard's End. And Helen shares that Mr. Wilcox has challenged her on her beliefs about women's suffrage and the dream of human equality, and that when she's been challenged, she can't actually articulate why she thinks what she does because she's never had to. She's always been surrounded by people who shared her exact viewpoints. So in this instance, Helen comes off as pretty vapid, but even though she's good-natured in the way she presents these conversations in her letters, there's a hint of pushback. I think Forster wants the reader to question Helen's assumption that Mr. Wilcox's opinions are more valid because he delivers them forcefully and decisively. Even in these first few pages, Forster presents extremes to suggest that maybe a healthy opinion is one that's both informed and humble, especially in the face of such huge questions. The Schlegels and Wilcoxes are foils in plenty of other ways. The Schlegels love all things artistic and ennobling, and they appreciate eccentricities. The Wilcoxes are the type who would fall asleep during a symphony. They're active, athletic sorts who don't really take the time to think about projecting any complicated or profound versions of themselves. You know, what interests them isn't beauty or knowledge, it's power. And there's an interesting passage where Mr. Wilcox takes Margaret Schlegel, the oldest sibling, house hunting, and he says to her, "You are not as unpractical as you pretend. I shall never believe it." Margaret laughed, but she was quite as unpractical. She could not concentrate on details. It is impossible to see modern life steadily and see it whole, and she had chosen to see it whole. Mr. Wilcox saw steadily. He never bothered over the mysterious or the private. They knew their own business, and he knew his. That's a pretty neutral example, but the narrator is making judgments more or less constantly. The Schlegels are a really fun, warm family, but they're also complacent and flippant and vaguely ridiculous. The Wilcoxes, there's something solid and reassuring about them, but they're also condescending and closed-minded. And then we have Mr. Bast, who's a lowly clerk who becomes a sort of pet to the Schlegel sisters. He suffers the brunt of the book's misfortunes, but again, the narration is by turns thoughtful and cruel in the way it frames his narrow life. So every character has his or her own mix of hypocrisies and endearments. And although this is quite an intellectual novel with this overriding cleverness, there's a lot of heart and charm here as well. And I think it's to the book's credit that it's nearly impossible in one casual reading to feel confident of where Forster comes down on the issues he presents. For example, the tagline is "Only Connect." It appears on the original title page, and Margaret says it, And it would seem to imply that acknowledging and engaging with different types of people is essential to a healthy modern society. But there are instances where the attempt to connect goes horribly awry. And it's fair to ask if everybody wouldn't be better off in their bubbles. And Mr. Wilcox suggests this at one point. And even in the cases where the connections they make are really moving, most prominently between Margaret Schlegel and Mrs. Wilcox, some foundation of that connection is built on what they don't discuss. So I know I think this and you think that, so let's both talk about something else. Okay, confession time. Almost everything about Howard's End seemed perfect for me. I thought it was going to be one of my books that I would just hand to everybody. But I'm trying to phrase this right. There was a particular strain of self-consciousness to the writing and an elusiveness too that distracted me a lot while I was reading. And just that chemical sentence and mind connection didn't happen. So even though I'll probably read more Forster, I'm not running out to do that now. But I will say, like, I've just thought about this book so much since I read it. And part of that is because of what it helped crystallize about classics generally. One of the main tensions we experience as adult readers is between interpreting characters as individuals and as symbols, as vehicles of larger societal commentary. And a lot of books speak more eloquently to one end of the scale or the other. But I think it's a feature of most great classics that they speak to both, that they actively tease that tension out. And I have to say that Howard's End is one of the most pristine examples of this I've come across. Whenever your expectations of these characters become too rigid, there's a human moment, something that reminds you that whatever their background, their reactions and feelings are theirs alone, that there's a dignity to recognizing individuality. But when you veer too far in that direction, Forster jolts you. Something happens where you expect a character to act autonomously, and instead they fall into the patterns of their background, and suddenly you remember that there are greater forces at work than just their personal choices. He's always tugging you so that you never settle. You're suspended between both elements. I thought a Zadie Smith take on Howard's End would be literary candy for me, partly because they're writers of a similar stock. You know, they're both naturally witty observers. But I also was really excited to hear from Smith because of certain passages in Howard's End, like this one, where Margaret discusses Mr. Wilcox's son, who's doing another tour of duty in Nigeria. He doesn't want the money. It is work he wants, though it is beastly work, dull country, dishonest natives, an eternal fidget over fresh water and food. A nation who can produce men of that sort may well be proud. No wonder England has become an empire. And you can just imagine Smith reading that and being like, oh, game on. You know, let's take this class story and do the obvious. Add race. And it's her refusal to simplify portrayals of race that's the real strength of this book, I think. She doesn't mimic the families in Howard's End. She creates her own structures. So our main family in On Beauty has as its patriarch a man named Howard, who's from Britain originally and comes from a humble background. He's white, and now he's an art history professor who's lived in America for a number of years with his wife, Kiki, who's a Black woman originally from Florida. And Howard has this long-running intellectual grudge against a fellow professor who is British, but originally from Trinidad, and who's a Black conservative. So at one point they find themselves in the somewhat bizarre situation of Howard defending affirmative action against his Black colleague who vehemently is opposing him. It's just a smart treatment of identities, how they're layered to such an extent that it's hard to pinpoint what aspect of someone's background is affecting their worldview in any given scene. Everything is much clearer in Howard's End, but here we have, you know, British viewpoints versus American viewpoints. You have Southern Black versus Caribbean Black, Black versus white versus mixed race. You have atheists and Christians coexisting, liberals and conservatives, practical people and highbrow people, creatives and academics, rich versus poor. And if all of this is seeming like a lot for somebody to chew off, yeah, it's not all adjusted. And so I guess it's not surprising that Smith is at her best in moments of small observations, the moments where she captures something so honest about the ways identities clash. One of my favorites is when a white professor says to Kiki, "You look marvelous. It's so good to see you. What an outfit. It's like a sunset. The red, the yellow, the orangey brown. Keeks, you're setting." "Honey," said Kiki, moving her head from side to side in a manner she understood white people enjoyed, "I done set already." Oh, and earlier in this scene, there's some nice commentary on the way that Kiki is viewed not just as a middle-aged Black woman, but as a large middle-aged Black woman. When you are no longer in the sexual universe, when you're supposedly too old or too big, or simply no longer thought of in that way, apparently a whole new range of male reactions to you come into play. One of them is humor. They find you funny. And then she's confronted by a white male professor who says, "That's pretty," looking down her and then up her again, as if you needed to get any prettier. And this is another thing they do. They flirt with you violently because there is no possibility of it being taken seriously. I just love this strain throughout of examining how bodies of different sizes and races, especially women's bodies, are viewed or aren't viewed as beautiful, as desirable. The mix of class and race also sets up a lot of comic scenes, as you could probably guess. The pathetic variety of comic more often than not. In On Beauty, the poor Mr. Bast character is a young Black man from Boston named Carl. And there's clear contrast drawn between Carl and Levi, who's the youngest son of Howard and Kiki. Levi is wannabe hood, and he pretends to be poor to anyone outside his family. And so there's a plot point where the electronics store where he works announces that they're going to make everybody take shifts over Christmas. And Levi is pissed about this. He's like, "No way, this is unjust. Let's all protest." And he tries to get everybody together. But of course, the coworkers who have no choice, who need this job to make money, aren't so willing to protest. This is also an example of a shtick that Smith drags out. It's a simple setup and funny for obvious reasons. Give us a paragraph on it. 2 tops. Oh no, we're gonna get pages. We get pages on this. What's weird for me is that one of On Beauty's main themes is also more broadly where it falters execution-wise. So much of the novel is about how men like Howard and his rival over-intellectualize everything to the point where they don't even understand their own feelings anymore. They treat the wrong things like they're complicated and the wrong things like they're simple. But the narrator is complicit in this to a degree that only sporadically feels intentional. And comparing Smith to Forster directly, she swings very much in the societal direction, to the detriment of the individual perspective. The key exception to this is Kiki. She's a really great character. She's grounded and warm and tough and complex, truly. And her relationship with Mrs. Kipps, who's the wife of Howard's nemesis, that friendship mirrors the friendship between Margaret Schlegel and Mrs. Wilcox in Howard's End in these subtle ways, painting a relationship that's sudden and surprising and lovely, unexpectedly lovely for both parties, and how maybe their differences cause them to appreciate their similarities even more. That being said, almost every other character strays to caricature, and the most you can say about their individuality is that they're individually irritating. Smith really harps on all the ways that they're ridiculous, and it's difficult to view them as anything more than these humorous little chess pieces for her to move around. I guess ultimately I'm disappointed because I really thought this would be my Zadie Smith book based on the premise and its homage to Howard's End and the fact that it won the Women's Prize. It seems like it would be a clear example of brilliant themes mixed with brilliant characters. And still, sentence by sentence, I would probably say that I prefer Smith to Forster. Early in On Beauty, I kept thinking, she's presenting so many interesting possibilities. I can't wait to see where she's going to take this. It was that buzzy feeling that you hope for. But even a little farther in, I already had that niggling thought, I get it. You're smart. You're so smart. Now give me something human, some human lifeline to cling to in this unending sea of cleverness. Both books have this unusual ending structure where everything comes to a climax and then there's this abrupt denouement. God, it's hard to continue that in a PG fashion. What I'm saying narratively, people, is that it's like jumping off a cliff, and then the final chapter is you inner tubing along a peaceful river at the bottom, and you're like, wow, I really thought we were going to be smashed to pieces, and we are bruised, but we're also on this river now, I guess. With Howard's End, the ending is pretty beautiful, despite what a departure it is from the preceding narrative. I don't know, it didn't feel unsatisfying to me. Whereas with On Beauty, I was like, it took us 450 pages to get to these emotional brouhahas that I don't care about. And now we still have 10 pages left of coyness. Like, except for Kiki, all of you can fuck off, all right? I'm done. I'm so done with you. Despite my criticisms, I should say that this pairing made my brain feel so alive. It really accomplished the goal of this project, which is for each book to give me a richer understanding of the other. And so I wouldn't discourage you from reading these together. But if you think realistically you're only going to make time for one, then make time for Howard's End. And then watch the adaptations because they're lovely. Let me know what you think about either of these books or about E.M. Forster and Zadie Smith in general, and I'll see you soon for another video.